My name's Harry Blagg, and I'm based in the University of Western Australia Law School. And apart from other things, I'm the director of a Centre for Indigenous Peoples and Community Justice Research, and that's a multidisciplinary team. Involves at any one time upwards of 10 Aboriginal people involved in doing research of one kind or another. I want to talk today about, actually, I'll plug our new book. No, I'm not, because it's too expensive to buy at the moment. I wouldn't recommend it. But it is available, I think, as an e-book on the Palgrave website, and it's something I've shared with my dear colleague Thalia Anthony from University of Technology in Sydney, and been a few years' work putting it together. I want to talk about it a little bit, but a few other things maybe as we go along. I want to acknowledge straight away the pay my respects to the Larrakia people, and it's always a great pleasure and privilege to be on Larrakia country. And in so doing, I think an important part of this talk is acknowledging their sovereignty and their use of law and culture as the basis for their various enterprises and initiatives. And we know there, I'm just going to... Well, I want to talk about a number of different things, because we've been engaged in quite a few different kinds of projects in recent years. But one of the particularly, if you like, that is a centre to it, it is about law and culture and the importance of centering and framing any work with Aboriginal communities within the framework of law and culture, however that is defined locally. And we take the position that's there very much in the Australian Law Reform Commission's massive study in the 1980s of Aboriginal customary law, but also the big study that was done in Western Australia from 2001 to 6, which I was fortunate to be a part of, which looked at the kind of how can we harmonise Indigenous and non-Indigenous notions and forms of law. And I still think that is still a very worthy pursuit. And we know from, and the CALAC there is Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Culture in Fitzroy Crossing, that some of you have had the privilege to be there would know, but it's the kind of central point for law and culture across the Kimberley, and we had the privilege to sit down with a lot of their old people and listening to them talk about law and culture, men and women. And as far as they're concerned, the law still provides a grammar for living. It provides guidelines for everyday life. It is given to us by our ancestors, and we don't have the right to change it. It is stable and enduring. And they would say that, you know, Gadia law, mainstream law, changes every day. You have a new politician every day, but our law remains largely the same. Doesn't change, and they point to a table with a tablecloth on and say, well, the tablecloth is Gadia law, but the table underneath it, you might not be able to see it, is still there. It's a structure. Now, we take that seriously. I think a lot of researchers and of all kinds and politicians go in and pay lip service to that, but they rarely think through what the implications could be in terms of practice. I mean, at the macro level, right down to the micro level in terms of work with communities. And that goes too equally strongly, oh yeah, I would like to put this one up, which is just to remind myself and others that as researchers we're not always the most welcome people in the world, and strangely enough, in Indigenous communities, and that we have to kind of understand that particular history that Aboriginal people have with policymakers and researchers and so on. Right. Yeah, just to mind that in the context of the criminal justice system, that imprisonment rates, sorry, I got the wrong way around, yeah, for Indigenous people have accelerated in what we call the Kansas societies. Canada, New Zealand, Australia and the USA have multiplied in recent years. although Australian Aboriginal people have the unenviable title of being the most incarcerated people in the world, higher than black people in the USA and other equivalent demographies. And we know that Indigenous people are grossly overrepresented in state prisons and police custody, and they suffer what writers these days, Louise Leconte in the United States, Chris Kinane over in New South Wales, called hyper-incarceration, which is goes beyond any normal rate of overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, and is linked to them as a people. It's about them, you know. They are incarcerated because they are Aboriginal in many instances. Yeah, one of the things that we comment a lot in our book about is because I'm a criminologist, I'm talking about criminology, but it could be many other of these Western disciplines that we brought onto this land and employ. Western criminology, we know from our work, is very reluctant to situate confinement, imprisonment, detention within what Quiano calls the colonial matrix of power. And as far as we're concerned, this inhibits exploration of the prison under conditions, particularly specific conditions of settler colonialism as a unique, distinctive form of government, and how it's functioned to maintain settler hegemony, and how this hegemony is contested by Indigenous peoples. One of the legacies of this Western-style view of the world is that it's fixated on the nation-state as the prime locus, say for comparative research or for understanding where important social change is going to take place. Increasingly, you know, writers from Indigenous writers from the Kansas societies and from South America and parts of Africa are talking about struggles above and below the nation state as well as within the nation state. So, for example, above the nation state is that international arena now with the United Nations Declarations of Indigenous People as an area of struggle and contestation, and also, importantly, it seems to us, the local level. You know, when we know from any anthropologists amongst us today would know that statement about Aboriginal people, Aboriginal culture sits in place. It's about place. If you define anything really defines a quick definition about Indigenous culture, it's in a place. It's in country. It's in a particular location. So, and that's not always, struggles at the level of the state don't always line up with those particular forms of contestation and change. So we also felt it very important when we wrote our book to critique comparative criminal studies as being too concerned with, because when you look at some of them anyway, you know, I remember the British ones, particularly in the West Europeans, would say, oh, on our table, looking at data, you know, the national data, Australia's a low incarcerating country. Well, no, it's not. If you pick out Aboriginality as an issue, it's a massively over incarceration society. So this is the problem with some of these kind of definitional issues. Yeah, okay, I moved on from that one. Yeah, sorry, I'm just struggling a little bit with my, we focused quite a bit about in our study, well, we looked at a whole range of different things which reflect the kinds of research that we've been doing at the centre and other kinds of work in other states. We've critiqued the prison as one of the starting points for our research, because that seemed to us to really coalesce many of the different concerns that we have about Western methodologies and Western ways of looking at the world. Now, I grew up as a criminologist reading Foucault and all these other writers, and they're very, very European. I don't really quite how European until we really start to think about that. But we know that the prison occupies a dominant position astride the criminological and penological landscape. It's this apex of punishment in Western societies. And the largely sociological and socio-psychological Euro-American prison literature maintains that inmates are dispensed to social death and subjected to scripts of moral inferiorization and mortification from the works of people like Goffman. But how, and Michel Foucault's work too, on the interiorization of discipline and control gave depth and weight to this sociological literature around confinement. However, how well does this carceral imaginaries travel to settler post-colonies like Australia? The specific form of Indigenous dispossession is often overlooked in the work of researchers undergirded by the critical humanist tradition of the Anglosphere. Struggles around social justice can obscure specifically Indigenous demands for decolonisation and sovereignty, which are endlessly deferred as social justice advocates prioritise generic human rights issues and reforms that privilege the Western individual subject. The social justice model also has a tendency to fragment Indigenous resistance and deflect decolonising impulses by privileging distinct oppressed groups, such as young people or women, a tendency sharpened through the growing influence of white saviour advocacy groups and charities. And this occurs at the expense of collective Indigenous struggles over sovereignty. And this is one of the problems, in a sense, with the that kind of European traditional literature, because it's bounded, even unconsciously, as a bias towards individual notions of human rights and so on, at the expense of collective rights of people who have been colonised by Western powers. We favour in our work a post-colonial perspective, as well as looking at settler colonial theories. And through reading of post-colonialism, we kind of gained an understanding of the prison as but one involuntary area of involuntary confinement against many, and not necessarily the most destructive. Because we know that for Aboriginal people, prison may be a source of pain, but not of shame. And our Western criminal justice system is premised on the assumption that people experience a social death when they go into prison, lose all of their connection with family, they lose their citizenship, and are stripped back, to a dehumanised figure. This doesn't happen for most Aboriginal people, because they retain all of their responsibilities and rights in the Aboriginal community. Yet they don't have that kind of Western citizenship to lose. Aboriginal people often are not shamed by having the police rock up at the door. So all of those things that we use as kind of moral scripts to define prison as a unique space of punishment, a la Foucault, actually are problematic in the post-colonial context. And there's an interesting whole body of literature now on the prison in India and South Africa and South America, demonstrating exactly this kind of thing, that it doesn't have a prison set up by a colonial power doesn't threaten the identities of the colonised people, who often, as Frantz Fanon justifiably said, you know, the native isn't shamed by having white values shouted at him and white notions of justice. So that's another kind of avenue for us. Well, so one of the things that we turn to in trying to understand some of this thinking was the works of not just post-colonial theories, but also the work of Giorgio Agamben, who some of you might be aware of. And Agamben it was who developed this kind of notion of the camp and bare life, yeah, and the figure who is homo sacer, who can be killed with impunity. And Agamben got these ideas through a reading of the literature around genocide and the Holocaust, but he took it much kind of more broader than that. The Agamben's ideas are very influential, but not influential in the sphere of research that probably you and I do. And we've been trying to kind of get people to kind of look at his work in the context of the colonial power and colonial prison, because he says that for the marginalised, for the colonised, for those who don't fit in with that notion of the nation state, then these are the people who end up in what he calls the camp. And the camp is a place of inclusive exclusion, where you're included because you've been excluded. And in those camps, you can become what he calls bare life, which is basically that you have no human properties, you can be killed with impunity and distance from the social world. So I think the Agambenian idea is a good one. We're trying to understand how indigenous peoples globally have been treated and dealt with by colonial power. The other right, of course, you might be aware of Patrick Wolf's work on settler colonisation has been an important element, I think, in any new thinking around the relationship between indigenous peoples and the state, because Wolf argued that colonisation isn't something that happened 200 years ago. It is a process, not an event. It's a structure. It continues in interactions between the police and Aboriginal people. It continues in court. It continues across a whole range of different forms of policy and process, and children's protection and a range of other things that, you know, the purpose of the colonial state, according to Wolf, is the extinguishment of Aboriginal sovereignty. And you can apply that kind of lens to look again at the whole way in which kind of in Aboriginal communities are structured and governed by colonial power. And we also used, like I said, post-colonial theory. I won't go into that at the moment, but there's also a massive international literature now, particularly from South America, I think, and Canada, work of people like Mark Rifkind and others who are using an Agamben framework, and that was mapped out by Patrick Wolf, because he said this notion of the camp and inclusive exclusion, he says it perfectly describes the relationships of indigenous people under settler colonisation. We're included only to the extent that we're going to be excluded. We're excluded from the normal rights and responsibilities of mainstream society and put in a specific place, but we're never allowed to be outside. Yeah, so following Agamben, we argue that the settler state is incapable of providing anything more than bare life to indigenous people on either the inside or the outside of prison. Indeed, we argue that the in and out dichotomy inside prison, where you're stripped of citizenship, or outside prison, where you have all of the attributes of civil society with its intended freedoms and so on, lose explanatory coherence in the settler post-colonial context. Yeah. And we see prison as another institution bent on disciplining souls and transforming identities. We don't view it that way. We just view it as one more staging post in the forced march towards sovereign extinguishment. So we don't see prison as this unique apex at the top of some hierarchical criminal justice system. We look at it laterally and horizontally and say it's one amongst the many different institutions of bare life that Aboriginal people are corralled in. And if you look at the histories we have recently with Aboriginal women about their connection with various institutions, from welfare, health, a range of things, have always had this massive tinge of approach to them as a form of bare life. Yeah, I'm going to move on a little bit because yeah, so just as a, sorry about that, I tend to do too many PowerPoints these days, and I blame students because I think we're going to end up being paid by the PowerPoint slide. You know, there's only 10 PowerPoints. How am I supposed to write my degree on your 10 points? Anyway, so I've kind of moved on a bit. So we maintain the need for decolonising rather than reforming vision when we get involved in terms of justice issues with, and it can't be a quick process, but a shift in power towards Aboriginal control across a range of sites. You know, we white fellas aren't going to go back anytime soon. So, you know, we have to reach some kind of compromise. And as I say, it can take place above and below the nation state. It doesn't always have to be at the kind of national level. And we've got to kind of reform the way, well, decolonise the way policing, courts and corrections operate. But we've also got to move resources away from those sites and into building community-owned healing processes. And that would involve, in terms of our notion of decolonisation, the creation of hybrid structures that work on the basis of two-way law. So that can involve a whole range of different practices that reduce the power of Western society and increase the power given to Aboriginal structures. And a number of these initiatives, this kind of thinking, although I know that the author doesn't like the term decolonisation at all, but which I think are, in a sense, decolonising. These include, in the Northern Territory draft Aboriginal Justice Agreement, they include things like recreation of law and justice groups. I was privileged, and I'm going back quite a long time now, show my age, to go around with people who were doing the law and justice groups back in the 90s and early 2000s, on Lachimanu and Alakarong and Yondamu. And that was a great model, but fell out of political favour, but that's going to be reinstated in some way. Support for Aboriginal cultural authority and leadership, reintroduction of community courts, and I don't know if you're aware, you know, they're in other states called things like Koori courts in Victoria, Murray courts in Queensland. We've had, there's a Noongar court, I think, Noongar court in South Australia, and we in Western Australia have to keep going like this with them, a bit like the Northern Territory, but they're still sentencing courts, you know, right? So you have to plead guilty to get into one of them, and but normally there would be a magistrate flanked by two elders or respected persons from their particular community who hopefully have some kind of connection with that person. And my reading of them, and I think from my reading of them certainly, and looking at quite a lot in Victorian places, they do make a significant difference to Aboriginal people who go in there. Now, many of them feel like they've been listened to for the first time. They want to see their elders. you know, and I've found it a really kind of positive experience. I think there are a number of other things that are attached to them now, particularly in Victoria, and through their, it's not an Aboriginal court, it acts as one day a week, the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, which they have in Collingwood in Melbourne, worth going to have a visit. It's the only place we've been into, only court we've ever been into, and I've been in many, where the security guard asks you on a couple of mile hour. It is really different vibe altogether. But the important thing about some of that work that they've been doing there is the importance of having a thorough screening at the point of connection with the court. Yeah? Quick but thorough screening around things like drug and alcohol issues of Aboriginal people. Particularly, there's an Aboriginal justice worker in that team, somebody who does housing, drug and alcohol, and some mental health, disability, and they do a report which is then put on the magistrate's desk virtually the same day. So it's a much quicker access into services, and they're having a lot of success with these people who repeatedly come before the criminal justice system, largely because of intergenerational trauma, cognitive disabilities, sometimes, you know, acquired brain injuries, homelessness, all those other things. They can get sorted out, and these people cease to be, you know, part of the kind of like spin dryer of the court system. And that seems to me, and looking at the way in that which that's used also in the curricular context, is a really good part of a decolonising mission. Yeah, because we're looking at the underlying issues. So I like hybridity, you know, and I think that you know, it's not going to happen that we're going to leap into a situation where Aboriginal law is on its own, but we can actually do far more to create a partnership between Indigenous law and culture and mainstream society. So this is, I'll just put this on, don't read it now, but if you want the slides at some later stage, this is just some of the work that we've done employing this kind of decolonising methodology in recent years. We did a major study, we just finished a second one, on Aboriginal women and family violence for ANROS, which is the Australian National Research Organisation on Women's Safety, and we're having some success with that report in getting people to think differently about family violence as a fact, not excluding notions around male power and so on, but also looking at the role of colonisation, intergenerational trauma, dislocation and so on as being the primary cause of much family violence in the Indigenous context. And we've just finished a bit of a process developing what we call the decolonising approach to diversion for young people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. We did quite a bit of work in Fitzroy Crossing and other places, looking at how they have approached the question of FASD, and we want to see that turned into some kind of a diversionary model, where if we're getting using some kind of light screening tool, that we can identify these kids early and move them out of the criminal justice system. We've had numerous cases of miscarriages of justice in Western Australia that have included Indigenous people with FASD who have been locked up under our Mentally Impaired Accused Act, which is just being reformed now. And so we're trying to kind of working with the police, the DPP and the courts to find models where we can move them out of that particular space and into community-owned networks of care and support. We've just finished a project too on through care, which we did, some of which we did in the Northern Territory, and we've done this ongoing work on Aboriginal night patrols as what we think a decolonised form of policing, something which, you know, shifts power or gives more authority to Aboriginal people and their communities. So this is the kind of one of the little things that we use when we're talking to communities and and talking to the agencies in government about what decolonising alternatives might begin to actually look like, right? And it's basically saying that part of this hybrid two-way law approach, we start from out here usually, on all that outer sphere there, legislation, because I'm in the law school, legislation, courts, care and protection. There's a massive investment in these. Prison, and we've got, in the context of family violence, we have that kind of Duluth model, which is highly focused on using the criminal justice system to change people's behaviour, when we know that it doesn't change Aboriginal people's behaviour at all. And we've got a bit more fancy, and we've introduced issues about prevention, multi-agency approaches, treatment approaches. But these are all up in the ether as far as most Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal people are concerned. And we say, well, look, when we sit down with Aboriginal people, we say, where do you start from? And they say, we start from country. Yeah, we start from country, we start from language, we start from our spiritual basis on this land, and that's what our law is. That's what our law and our justice system are. So, if we move across here, we're saying that a liminal space, any anthropologists in there? They're good, because I misuse their terms all the time. They get really offended, You can't use liminal like that. Have you seen my PhD? No, I've not. I don't want to read that. Working with family. Cultural health models, not just physical health. Healing, the big word really in this context. Aboriginal justice issues. Use of outstation. Building Indigenous enterprises. We've been doing work with the Madu. I don't know if you know, they're the traditional owners of the Pilbara. And like many other places, they've developed up their own ranger programs, which is just absolutely wonderful, going on country, caring for country, building up country as a hybrid economy, all those kind of things. But they've tied it in with a program called Wamawanga, which means talking about alcohol in Madu. And they've really successful relationships now with the police and the courts, where people who would just normally just go to jail, going out in country, getting clean, talking about themselves, learning skills on country. And this is exactly the kind of model that we've been developing in partnerships with Aboriginal communities in terms of work with kids with FASD. Because there's no medical cure for things like that. A baby sitting literally in a sack of alcohol for months, And there isn't any quick way in which those kind of things are going to get resolved. But the same kind of things apply. Our system creates anxiety, trauma, it brutalizes and so on. So they say, well, we want to take these FASD kids out in country. In fact, they are taking them out in country because of rhythms. We've all been, white, even as white fellas get it, don't we? Being out somewhere on country with people and you just go, you start breathing, and the same with these kids and people. So this is the area where obviously we're not going to get rid of this space overnight, but we are capable, I think, of building up this kind of a process where we start to resource this area and start to disconnect these issues from, or decenter these issues away from the state and onto Aboriginal communities. Now it sounds like a bit fanciful, but I mean, at least people are talking. We've got, even the cops have had the light bulb moment in Western Australia around FASD in particular, because they're arresting these kids all the time. They're the really, really mad ones, of burning the cars, going out, they put them in a bail hostel together, whoosh, inflammable. And they're saying, yeah, I knew a kid like that on Beagle Bay. He was the nicest kid you could ever meet. But he just couldn't stop breaking into school, burning down cars. And I used to say to him, why? And of course he didn't know. It's not a question of won't understand, it's can't for kids with FASD. They just really can't get it. It's not that they won't get it. And they say, yeah, and they're sweet kids, you know, often, but they just can't have no control over their inner networks. And they require what we call an external brain, or I call external scaffolding around them, which could be a mentor, somebody paid from a community, and so on, even paying family, and taken out on countries as much as possible. And we thought about maybe why can't we move schools out on there? Why should school always be a building, some gaddia building down the street? Why can't we shift school and health and these other things into an up-country model of some kind? I don't know, maybe they exist. Maybe in Arnhem Land, if they do anywhere. But this is a very much, I think, similar to what I've heard people up there at Miwatch and other places talk about. And I think slowly and finally, we are beginning to get it. Now, I don't want to talk all day, just quickly alert you to some of the work we've done on family violence, which takes a very similar view. One of the work was done with Emma Williams, who's a member of this illustrious centre. It's about decentering. It's not about a total revolution. We're saying we're going to decenter that domestic violence model in family violence cases. Not abandon it, but it's not. I think there's a lot of research showing now that a lot of so-called things that get pushed into the system as domestic violence are actually couple fights, and they're alcohol related, and people with mental illnesses and acquired brain injury and so on. They're not standard domestic violence scenario. And we're just completing this final one, this one with Anne Rose, where we've taken some of those ideas that I've discussed and said how do they apply in the context of preventing family violence? How can we decolonise this process in a way where we can place some of the primary responsibility within Aboriginal communities? What would law and culture look like in this context of prevention, family violence, and intervening with family violence and healing family violence? Well, a lot of it, of course, would be on country, and family and Aboriginal law and culture would play a key role. So we looked at the kind of things like, you know, who would normally, under traditional law, take responsibility for protecting victims, who would be the ones who would sanction and punish offenders, you know, what can we learn from those models, what's applicable these days, you know. So, yeah, so I'm just finally, if I can find it, yeah, just a last one. There's another little diagram I use. So we are the cement blocks over here, Aboriginal people over here, and the things there are about cultural health, cultural governance, cultural security, and we try to move, but we're still really hidebound. So we're creating what we call we can create what we call these engagement spaces, where we can have a different kind of a dialogue about these things. And as I say, they don't always have to involve government, but government's where the money is. And we had at some stage to include that. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.